It is a pleasure to introduce Joanne Pagèze from the University of Bordeaux, from the Department of Language and Culture, who has a strong interest in English medium instruction and international teaching and learning. Since 2014, Joanne Pagèze has been project leader of Edificio Internacional, that I actually experienced and visited with my own eyes in Bordeaux a couple of years ago. And it was a very, very interesting project, and it is truly a challenge, a defeat, because the French context, like the Spanish context, has interesting similarities, and that's one of the reasons why we invited Joanne to be here. This Défi International is a university-wide teacher development program for EMI, English Medium Instruction, and is currently carrying out action research on this context, and she'll talk about this now. She has worked in higher education since 1998, in English for specific purposes, and in the development of what we know as CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, initiatives in life sciences. She is our participant in the European Strategic Partnership EQUIP, and I happen to be there too, working together. So we met a couple of years ago and realized that there were very interesting synergies between us, and that we would definitely collaborate in the future, which is now. She is, right now, she is a board member of the European Language Council, and I think this is a very interesting a vantage point, which actually gives a linguistic visibility to language issues at university in Europe. And she's also assistant editor of the European Journal of Language Policy. Please welcome Joanne Pagèze with a warm hand.
And internationalization with Emma, because as she said, it's always a very fruitful conversation. So thank you for welcoming me today, and I'm looking forward to finding out about what's happening in competency on these issues. So when Emma invited me to talk about my international challenge, our international challenge in Bordeaux, I thought I would tell a story, and it turns out this story is quite, like these Spanish stories where people move around. You have to get into the terrain and the context to tell the story. So, start with a few pictures of Bordeaux, just to tell you that it's a very nice place, it's Saint-Emilion. We have the Cité du Vin, which has just opened, and it's a very pleasant place if you'd like to come and visit the city. Here we are in university PowerPoint that presents what we do, and this is where I work, and maybe my bicycle somewhere in the front here. Okay. I'm not going to tell you the long history of Bordeaux. Like competency, we've been around for a few hundred years, but there have been many ups and downs in French history, and we have been one university, four universities, one university, four universities. Lots of things have happened. A bit of trouble in the 60s, universities were split up, had to keep people apart. Two things which are really interesting, I think, for where I am and how I came to be where I am today. In 2014, three of the universities of Bordeaux merged to make one university. The literature and arts section of the university stayed outside of this big merger, but is still part of the Umbrella Fund, which is the Initiative of Excellence, which was a future investments program that was set up in France to push certain universities forward to develop large structures to be more competitive, more visible in today's globalized world. So I'm very much a product of that, and this is what we're going to explore here. So just very briefly, you'll see that we have very similar contexts and similar issues in Bordeaux. We're now a 53,000 student university, which makes us the third university by size in France. So statistics here. Here are our international facts and figures. What's interesting is we have some nice international study programs, and we have made quite a little headway with Erasmus Mundus. As you can see on the right here, half of our international students are from Africa, and then the second group of students are from European context. But we are very much trying to develop internationalization, and I don't think we're alone in this. Okay, here I am, okay, international challenge. I'm actually in the slideshow. We're putting this forward. We want to internationalize our study programs. That's not me, we want to internationalize our study programs, we want more English taught courses, and in 2014, with this endowment investment fund, I was asked to create pedagogical and linguistic support for teaching in a multicultural context. So, as I said to you, I thought I would tell you the story of this, and then I started to look at it, and I realized that it wasn't, I was going to have to talk a lot about context, and it was going to be quite a lot of scene setting and context building before you can really explain what we did. So we will get to what we did, but I'm going to talk about the context and how that determines what we did. And again, this is very much a reflective process, because for me, with internationalizing curriculum in higher education, it needs to be reflective, because each context is different, each culture is different. So I found a very interesting conceptual framework by a very illustrious academic and a friend. What we can see here is that when we talk about teaching English, lots of different things come into play and will change what happens on the ground. For example, the roles of English, lingua academica. How can this coexist with French as a language, and what imagined language identities are involved with that? Academic disciplines. Some disciplines are extremely internationalized, every discipline is different. What are the disciplinary practices with communication? How can we address that in the way we teach in English? What legislation issues are there? What is the language management? Is there a language policy? And as we often say in my community, and if there isn't one, that in itself is a policy. Okay? And it has an impact on how we build internationalization. Who are the agents of this? English teachers, disciplinary specialists, university governance, international relations people. Who are the people who are pushing, working, developing this locally? My project, which is a development program, a teacher training program, is part of the practices and processes that we are putting in place in Bordeaux. And this is very much determined by the way in which internationalization is playing out in French higher education. And I think here it's very important to look at this through the framework of globalization, because we talk a lot about globalization, but what globalization really is when you're in your university setting is an interaction, a dialogue between local forces, local practices, local ideas, and a desire to be part of this global world of higher education. And so there's this tension between the two, and tension between French academic culture and the way education is changing. So I couldn't tell it as a story. I'm telling it through a framework, and then we'll come back to my story. So I've told you a little bit who I am and how I got there, and Emma introduced me, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm fairly typical of the kind of people who are working in English medium instruction, in developing teaching in English. I'm an ESB specialist, so we're the kind of applied linguist, interested in disciplinary communication. So we're used to this interdisciplinarity, finding out what the biologists need, finding out what the political scientists need to use English. So we've had this role through the last 40 years of development of education. ESP teachers, practitioners are also thinking about, what are the needs of the learners to do what they do in their context? And this is highly appropriate for developing English medium instruction. However, one of the problems, I think, with internationalizing the curriculum through English is that the expertise tends to be in this community of language specialists. And yet we're not at the coalface. We're not in the classroom with the students. And one of the objectives of the program that we've put in place in Bordeaux is to try and break down these barriers and to help the thinking about English medium instruction become available to teachers teaching their discipline in English. So this is an important issue, is this agency and how can we work together. Higher education is changing. That's not very exciting information for you. It's very complex, and I invite you to cherish that complexity. I refer to the philosopher Edgar Morin here. I'm not going to go into detail, but it's a complex world. Universities are constructing themselves as organizations and have been for the last 20 years. And we talk a lot about what is the best way to organize universities. French education is undergoing a period of immense change, but all higher education institutions are subject to the forces of change. Forces of globalization, that I've already mentioned. Also, new ideas about teaching and learning that are very much the zeitgeist at the moment is how do people learn, and information from cognitive science and the way we think about learning are changing and transforming the way we think about higher education. Technology related to learning, and you'll notice that I've crossed out the new, because I think, we're at a different phase now. We're now moving past the, here's the technology, to how is the technology really going to support learning and teaching. Another aspect that I'm sure you're familiar with is new public management in universities, which is very much what has happened with the mergers of French universities, new ways of organizing these very traditional, archaic institutions that we have to live with and that we have to learn how to manage ourselves. A very interesting political scientist, Christine Musselin at Sciences Po Paris, has done a lot of work on universities and how she identifies two features that really complicate the way that universities are emerging as organizations. The first one is weak functional interdependence. It seems a bit technical, but it really means that the left hand can function very well without the right hand. It means that academics have a strong allegiance to their discipline and their faculty, and maybe don't see themselves as part of the institutional project. And they can coexist quite happily in separate worlds. And she says this is something which plays a strong role in the way that universities try and organize themselves. And the second idea, which is a little bit, I think we have to be careful with this because things are changing, is she talks about teaching in universities as being a very unclear technology, as very much an emanation of the habitus of the academic persona, something that comes from your personal expertise as a disciplinary expert and not a well-documented practice that it can be shared. Again, this is an idea that we need to moderate perhaps with the way things are moving now. But if I'm coming to you with all this information about the complexity of universities, is to try and say to you that internationalization shouldn't be taken outside of this. It's part of this complexity. It's an agent of change, and it's also caught up in the process of these changes. And we need to be able to keep all of the balls in the air as we look at the way our context in universities is changing. French higher education, so a brief overview of our context. So it's the third country for incoming mobility, second language learnt in the world. A lot of international learning and teaching is already happening. It's happening in French. It's not really visible in terms of international learning. It's just happening. It's the people are coming to France, they're learning in French. And in many ways, the work that is being done on teaching in English and developing international classrooms in English can inform these French medium international context. It's something that we haven't explored, and inclusiveness and diversity in education is really something that we're going to be faced with in the next years, and we need to measure this. Few details about the French system. I'm sure that I imagine many of you understand a little bit how things are in France, but just in case you don't, we have a very open university system. Everyone with the baccalaureate can come, €200 a year. Unfortunately, afterwards, it's not, there's quite a lot of selection that kicks in. It's kind of survival of the fittest. So huge numbers of students in first years of university dropping off as things go through. So this is very much in our minds when we talk about internationalization at home. How are we going to give all of these young people an international experience? Next to this, we have extremely elite schools of engineering and business, the Grandes Écoles, which have very focused market share and are very keen to be very competitive, very selective schools. And in between the two, we have selective technical institutes, the IUT, with short courses, which are practical and applied sciences, but again, with a small selection. So
all of these are operating in French higher education, and on the Bordeaux campus and funded by the Initiative of Excellence, we have examples of all of these. So we're kind of together with our very different contexts in one big structure. English medium instruction. So this is teaching disciplinary content in English. In France, as Gail Taillefer, who is a good, has done a good description of the situation in France, she says with a nice euphemistic that we're a relatively recent player. We were late to the game, and there are various reasons for this. I'm going to go a little bit into the history of language and French national identity to explain this. So, since the Second World War, there has been quite a lot of control and defense of the French language. In 1966, the Défense de la langue française, this is de Gaulle, it was kind of resistance to American influence, American cultural influence, and a desire to protect French culture. In 1994, we had the Toubon Law, which was prohibitive and prescriptive. It actually restricted the use of English in public life, in advertising, business, education. Unfortunately, and is often the case, the rules were broken, and this has had a very big impact on the way that English instruction developed in France, because it was kind of slash and burn or renegade EMI. People were doing it and ignoring the law. That happens. And it was developing in sporadic pockets. So, it wasn't possible to have a policy or a movement or to think about this clearly, because it was happening kind of in everyone's view, but it was not legitimized. The push for these sporadic pockets of slash and burn internationalization came from the highly internationalized disciplines, the sciences, the economics, political science, places where there was French excellence and expertise in the discipline and a frustration at not being able to communicate that to other nationalities through problems with language. So English medium instruction was growing, but there wasn't a legal situation to actually standardize it. At the same time, we have the Bologna process from through the 2000s, which was remapping the physical and mental boundaries of Europe and changing the way that we think about learning and multilingual learning. Things changed in 2013 with the Fioraso law, which allowed the use of English in higher education, and a senatorial law the same year which fixed this in what could be done. And you'll notice the date. The project in Bordeaux started in 2014. The university merged in 2014, and 2013 French law allowed this practice to be legitimized. As I said, a lot was happening, but it wasn't legitimate. Interestingly, in 2015, just after we'd started doing with the program, the General Inspector of Higher Education came to visit us. In fact, they did a tour de France, and they visited lots of institutions to get a picture of what was happening. And we had a chance to meet and discuss what we were doing with the Inspectrice Générale. It's a very important person in French education. And it was very clear to us when we talked with her that it was go, 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 this is what we need, attention to learning of French as a second language, but what are you doing? That's fine, develop. So there's been a real change on this issue. And this change is really a negotiation from a kind of a francophonie world to a more multilingual view that has been definitely helped with the Bologna process. I think it's important to talk about this because it's had a big impact on the way that academics live the internationalization of education. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about English medium instruction and the way in which it is represented in French higher education. So the problem with English medium instruction is that it has bad baggage. It's kind of from the wrong side of the tracks. It's got the word instruction in it. It's not very much, it's not very touchy-feely. It's seen as being a top-down policy, very much linked to globalization, English as a lingua franca, a vehicular language, a very pragmatic solution for content-focused delivery of instruction. English medium instruction emerged from the parallel language context of Northern Europe. I don't know if you are familiar with this idea of parallel language context, but for example, in Finland, very quickly after the Second World War, they realized that people weren't going to speak Finnish and that they would be developing English in parallel to Finnish in many aspects of public life. So it's kind of seen as something coming from outside, also from American welcoming of foreign students and Asian universities expanding. English medium instruction has this connotation of being imposed from outside and has connotations of cultural imperialism, which don't wash well in French higher education. On the other side, we have CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. CLIL, again, already we have learning. Whew, that's better. Right? We're talking about learning. The background of CLIL comes from work that was done in schools in the 70s. It's very much emerged from the school environment. It's about bilingual education, interculturality, the role of different languages working together with a disciplinary objective, a language learning objective. It's seen as an enriching environment, and it's very much associated with European multilingualism. Now, I've created this real dichotomy on the board. In reality, things are not anywhere near as divided. What is interesting to say is that in terms of research in English medium instruction in France, there's been very, very little, and it's mostly been about policy, university policy, what do universities want to do. In the CLIL context, we have some very high-ranking professors and researchers looking at bilingual, multilingual, intercultural learning, and they've looked a lot at the cognition and the learning in these contexts. So we have a French tradition in exploring this as a learning context, but not so much in English medium instruction, but the two have really fed into each other. One specialist, Philipson, who talks about the way that English has come into education, says that there's kind of a European paradox. You know, in the multilingual push for development in higher education, much of the thinking on learning has helped develop the international context with local language and the second context in English. So this is my kind of personal view of where we are in France, in my context, probably better to say in Bordeaux with English medium instruction, which we're still using because it's the name, although it's not the best name. We're looking at bilingual, multilingual education, internationalized learning at home, globalization, an enriching context with English as a lingua academica. Okay, so these two contexts are kind of merged in the way in which we are organizing this practice. So what are we trying to develop in Bordeaux with Défi International? On the one hand, we're trying to develop CLIL within the university. And this is where we have English teachers and disciplinary teachers working in some form of co-teaching. And we see this in degree programs, in the IUT technical schools. And the idea is that there are shared outcomes, language outcomes and disciplinary outcomes, an adapted pedagogy for this, and that the evaluation will take into account language skills and disciplinary skills. This is actually quite hard to engineer in programs. It's very dependent on personalities and people. But if we can do it, it's very, very supportive of internationalization because it's something that is done and which prepares the terrain for learning and teaching in English. And English teachers understand better how disciplinary teachers roll. And disciplinary teachers can borrow and see how communication is managed by English teachers in second language classrooms. So it's a win-win situation if you can do it. On the other hand, we have English medium instruction, which is disciplinary teaching in English, with no explicit language objective. And this is what we see in international tracks, in international master's programs. Here we hope that there is an adapted pedagogy, and I'll come to that in a minute. And the evaluation here will be very just focused on disciplinary competencies, but it may include, or obviously will include, disciplinary communication. So these two contexts are what the program I'm involved in is trying to develop, and very much one feeds the other. Students are happy to do CLIL, and teachers are happy to be involved in CLIL context in higher education because they may want to be an international master's program. And teachers who are going to participate in international master's programs are happy to have had experience in CLIL. So this is kind of why these two contexts need to be linked. Okay? Different worlds, different things, but beneficial for developing internationalization. Rapidly, I'm going to talk about two contexts of English medium instruction. Here, I'd like you just to think about how each context is different depending on who's in the room and what you want to do. On the left here, this is a group of biology students in second year. The group is composed of motivated and reasonably able students, but not the best students, because that's an issue as well. You know, if you're taking the best students to do teaching English with them, it's problematic. So students that are selected for their interest in learning in English and who are motivated for that. French lecturer, French students. And here we see that the teacher of biology is very happy to be using English, but because the discipline is extremely internationalized, and what I see when I observe these classrooms, when I talk to teachers, is that there is some moving to and fro between languages, which is what we call translanguaging. And this translanguaging is actually a motor for pushing concepts in biology, because it allows the redefinition of concepts in biology. So here it's a completely francophone group working in English. It could be internationalized. You would just need, you know, some international students, and it's open to international students. But both languages are present in the room, although 99.9% of the teaching is in English. Okay? And we can compare this to a neuroscience international master's program. More than 8 nationalities, very selective, highly competitive. This is, again, represented and figured as a scene of pedagogical transformation in the university, but it's more of a multilingual, multicultural learning space. And the difficulties and the interest here is how do the different academic cultures come to the same page? English is a shared language. In fact, there is actually more language invisibility here, because there's no point referring to French, because there are people who do not speak French in the classroom. But there is translanguaging in the peer-to-peer communication between students. So if I'm showing you these two contexts, it's to really say that when we talk about teaching English, we need to think about each context, what the teacher is doing, and what the students want, and who is there and why. And that will change what is happening in the room. So I'm now coming more to what we have put in place in Bordeaux and what we need to do to develop quality English medium instruction. First question that teachers ask is, what's the impact? What's the impact on disciplinary learning? Will this be quality teaching if I'm teaching in a language which is not my own language and not their language? In fact, the question they're asking is, how much does language get in the way of learning? And it's probably better to frame that question as, what is the role of language in learning, which is much more helpful. And the other thing that they're asking is, how can it be done? And that's really what we have tried to show, is how it can be done. Very rapidly, what we know about English medium instruction is, and this is what I tell to the teachers who come into the program. First of all, I tell them the bad news. I say, language load. It's heavy, because if everyone has a shared language, you have to accept that that's a constraint. Right? It doesn't matter if you're really good. It doesn't matter if they're really good. If it's not everybody's first language, there is going to be an increased language load, and that will have an impact on cognitive load. Learning is tough. Okay, the way information is presented to learners, the things that teachers ask learners to do, the mental processing involved in learning is related to language. And so we need to take that into account. Participation, interaction. If we look at the research on English medium instruction, we know that students in these contexts are not so spontaneous to ask questions and to interact. Also, when you have 8 different cultures in the room, it's very important to be aware that they have different profiles and backgrounds, and that's going to have an impact on learning too. Finally, assessment. Why do students come into university? They want diplomas. And if you're teaching in English in an internationalized context, you need to think about the impact on assessment, because students need to be evaluated and they need to leave the university with a diploma that reflects their skills. So that's the bad news. But there's lots of good news if you look at the research. There are strategies and solutions which, if we look at reports on practices and the literature that is available on learning in English medium instruction contexts, and we find out that when there's careful pedagogical scaffolding, when learning sequences are carefully constructed, when teachers are very careful with timing and the content, the volume of content that they propose to learners, things are fine. If you know the students are not going to participate spontaneously, then you need to plan for it. And when you plan for it, you have the interaction that you want. Use the group, peer-to-peer learning, small group work, pay attention to group dynamics, and you get the interaction that pushes learning. Make everything that's implicit about your learning context, and dissertation, une note sur 20. How does the learning culture work in your context? So this is it's kind of the elephant in the room with international learning, because if you say to me, what do you need to be able to do to be a good teacher in English? Well, number one, you need to be able to speak English. And number two, you have to be a good teacher. What expertise for disciplinary teaching in English? One of the things that we find with disciplinary specialists is that there tends to be an underestimation of the role of language in learning, okay? And this is, again, documented in the literature, and I see it every day. I don't teach language, the physics teacher says, the biology teacher says, and then you go into the room and you see there is all this negotiation over defining, terminology, explaining, which is very, very much to do with language. So it's one of the things that is very important is to bring to disciplinary teachers this reflection that knowledge and understanding are constructed in the language of the discipline in a learning environment provided by a content specialist. So all teachers are, to a great extent, language teachers. It's academic and disciplinary expertise which authorizes teachers to teach in English, and their language competence is very much boosted by this disciplinary expertise. The profile of teachers that are coming into the project are teachers who are reading, publishing, and presenting their research in English all the time. Some of them have done postdocs in other countries. Some of them have had experience in Anglophone countries, but by no means all of them. Some of them have never really spent a long time in another country, but they are using English all the time in their academic practice. This, of course, is highly discipline specific, okay, and we need to remember that. So we're not looking at people who are learning the language. We're talking about a transfer of skills from researching and being an academic in English to the classroom in English. Which brings me back to my French context, just really briefly. The habitus of French academics is very much linked to a certain model of linguistic perfection. The reasons for this are in the history of academia in France, and a certain French unilingualism, which is linked to the way in which, through history, and it's well documented, I have the reference here for Boyer, French state building very much meant stamping out regional languages and stamping out dialects. And this has really meant that the habitus of being an academic is someone who masters the French language and is a representative of that conceptualization in an academic language, French. So this means that national academic identities have been forged in response to English as a global language. Now, we saw earlier that this has been a bit complicated by legal issues in France, but it means that we find two profiles and two poles of representation to do with language in my context. On the one hand, teaching English can be framed as a loss of complexity, as a deficit, okay? But on the other hand, teaching English is part of cutting-edge globalized academic practice. So teachers need to find a way to situate themselves between these two poles. Loss and I want to be good and I want my students to have the benefit of the best in this discipline. So how can we overcome this? How can we help teachers find a place for themselves in teaching English? Well, seeing it as an extension of disciplinary communication, and seeing this as an identity through lingua academica, not some native speaker model, but an academic language that we use. A shift from focus on content and language, from a focus on a poor translation of me, to a communication and learning situation, and a focus on us. Okay? And this is one of the reasons why I think that the changing of universities in regard to learning and teaching is very instrumental, and we're wrapped up in this process, because this has definitely been a facilitating aspect of the program that we've put in place in Bordeaux. So I hope I'm okay for time. Am I? Okay. So here are the objectives of the program that we've put in place. We wanted to develop the notion of English medium instruction as a specific learning context. We want to be able to accompany teachers in adapting for this context. We needed to move the focus from vehicle language to communication, pedagogy, and learning, to build confidence and to nurture talent, to develop and promote teamwork, to try and learn from this process, because it's a relatively new process for us, and to raise awareness of this for ESP teachers and in the university community. And we needed multiple approaches and multiple entries into the program because we have so many different profiles. So here we are. This is the program that we've put in place. There are 8 strands to the program. Important strand is needs analysis, in that when a team of teachers come and say, we want to do this teaching in English, we want to put in place an international program, we will see each group of teachers and we'll say to them, tell us about your teaching, tell us about how you work, what do you do in class, what documents do you use, how does it work? And through that dialogue we're able to say, have you thought about this, have you thought about that, and to talk about the impact of language on disciplinary learning. And from this needs analysis, we invite the teachers to come into an intensive course that we run for 3 days. And this is 3 days of reflective practice in immersion in English. And it's a course which is, there are language aspects, but there's an awful lot of pedagogical strategy. In fact, in these 3 days, we try and make sure that the 16 teachers are living what it's like to be in an international classroom. They're experiencing the impact of language on learning as they're trying to take on ideas about international education, and they're experimenting with different models of learning, flipped classroom, interactive lecturing, different strategies for group dynamics. And what we're trying to do in this intensive course is encourage them to reflect on what will be the impact of teaching English in my discipline, and what changes can I make that will suit my practice and that will support communication in English. We also offer coaching. So typically someone will come through the training course and then come back and see us to show us materials they prepared, and we'll listen and give them some guidance for the language aspect, but we'll also talk about how they plan to put that into the classroom. We run lunchtime conversation on 8 sites across the university. This is a very open strand of the project. It's for people who say, I research in English, but I don't get much chance to speak, and I'm not ready to do 3 days of I can't come for 3 days in immersion. I haven't got the time, I don't want to do that. And they come into conversation and they realize that, it's okay. And then they write back to you and they say, maybe I would like to come and do your training course. We also fund teacher shadowing projects where we can put English teachers and disciplinary teachers together. We have some online resources that we're trying to develop for distance learning. We can support and finance translation of supports, but if people ask us to do this a lot, that tends to ring alarm bells in my head about, really, are we ready to teach in English? Most importantly, we're trying to learn from the experience, and we do class observations, and we bring teachers back to talk to each other about what they've done in the classroom. So this is a very global approach which allows people to come in at different angles, and it's been quite effective in supporting internationalization. So I'm going to move further through this. Just a few I'm going to show you some data from these courses, not mainly to give you an idea of the disciplinary profile, so you can get an idea of how, of the impact of the project on teachers. So before teachers come into the program, the first thing they say to us, I want to improve speaking and listening. I want to get better English. And that's typically the posture of teachers coming into the program. And then after they've come through and they've done some training with us, they've done the intensive course, what we see is there's a slight shift. You know, we say to them, what aspects of the course do you think will be the most useful for your teaching in English? And what I think is interesting here is we can see how the pedagogical implementation of that has come up in their priorities. They can see what they can use to support communication in English. And here we see that English pronunciation and intonation have been identified as something important. What I think is interesting here is it shows that there's a kind of an organization. They can see which aspects of their English will make a difference for what they want to do, and they've more clearly identified where they need to work to be an effective teacher in English. I'm going to skip through this. Another thing that we're doing is encouraging teachers to do kind of reflective journals or reflective, to write to us. We say to them, what happened? What did you do? And they tell us how things went. And we think this is very important because, they tell us that what they didn't translate, they did this, they did that, it was difficult, that didn't work, I wasn't happy. Simply engaging in this conversation, we feel is, supporting, developing skills for teaching in English. So, last points. What have been the impact of this project since 2014 to 2017? Where are we now? I would definitely say, and we can see this in the extension we've had to programs in English, that this is contributing to building a community of practice around education in English. We always have early adopters and movers and shakers. They were the people who were doing the renegade EMI in the first place. They're keen, they're ready, they want to do it. To build programs, to build courses, to have students come through English instruction and feel that they can aim to go into international programs. Because that was a problem. People were saying, we have an international master's, we have lots of international students, but the French students don't want to go there. Well, why would they go there if they haven't had an experience of learning in English before? So we've been able to do this with the project by extending the number of people who can teach and are willing and able to teach in English. So I've called this the zone of proximal development, but it's the people who are like, I'm not sure, what will change, how can I do it, is it a good idea? And we've been able to bring those people on board. And next to them we have young, they tend to be young, I'm sorry, young researchers, young academics who come into the university and they're ready and they want to do this, but they have no power, they have no hand in the organization, but they can jump on board. They're curious, they want this skill, they want to know about learning and teaching. So what we've been able to do with this project program is to extend the group of people, and I think this is really important. It cannot be a minority of isolated, excellent or cutting-edge teachers. We have to bring the whole community on board. So we've seen now that there is a better articulation between degree and master's programs. I just mentioned that. We've developed some international tracks in degree programs which allow us to offer some teaching in English all the way through for students that are ready and willing to do that. And we've been able to extend existing programs. Very important is that we've been able to develop a better understanding of internationalization, and that's something that I think is a constant, how many people really understand what it means to be in international education at university? It's not something that everybody understands now. We still have to work on this. Shifting from English medium instruction to an idea of an international classroom. We've definitely made some headway on that, and it's very important to do that. Clarifying the role of English in French university settings, reframing things in terms of multilingualism. It's also been a pretext for a change in university teaching and learning, which again, I think is, it's part of this complex situation that we're living at the moment. And, finally, and I think this is really important, we're doing this here now in and for the University of Bordeaux, for our French context, for better internationalization and better globalization. Okay. So I think I'll finish there. I'm sorry if I've talked perhaps for a bit too long, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Joanne. That was a very interesting and complete overview of what's going on in France. You touched upon the national level, then you went into the institutional level in Bordeaux, and I think, you understand why I invited her. She really offers a very interesting reflection of the whole thing. We have a couple of minutes for questions. I think they could be asked in English if you prefer. We also have some notes that can go around if you prefer to write them, and then we can ask, or if you want to approach her later, okay? I would like to ask a question or a comment. I think it's very clear from what you said that this is not only about English language teaching. This is not about instruction, as you said, that this is a change of attitude, that this is a change of mindset, and that this definitely has to involve everyone. As you say, this idea that it can only grow if, the whole, if you want, institution is more or less involved in different degrees. And I would really like to extend this to the idea of that all students are international students, and all teachers are international teachers. Because whether we're teaching in Spanish or in English or in French, or we have Chinese students or Latin American students, the idea that all students should have some kind of international exposure. And I think in Bordeaux you're actually working in that line. I was just wondering how many, you had some data, but I mean, are the teachers supported in some way to kind of engage them in all this?
Make the transition, yes, because, well, that was very much what we asked for from the very beginning. We said we're going to have to incentivize teachers, and people are not too happy about that, because it's like, oh, if we incentivize them for everything, we'll have to, we're talking about, money here. It's very complicated to talk about money. What actually the IDEX, the Initiative of Excellence, allowed us to do was to say that for programs, for big projects, for teams coming together for the first 2 years, we offer, we call it a bonification, so like a sort of a little bonus in teaching hours to cover the transformation. And this is quite interesting as well, because it allows us, I mean, I was always a bit, I don't want people to be forced into the training sessions, because they won't be happy customers. Yeah. But in fact, we say, if you want to do this and this is your project, you need to come into the training. And so we have groups of teachers coming in. First group very keen, and then they say, oh, it's okay, it's not bad, it's quite good, and then more come along, and they are able to get extra teaching hours to lighten their teaching load for 2 years. And then the idea is this will go away because they'll be ready to continue.
Okay. Questions to the floor, please? There's a microphone going round, or en español también, como queráis. ¿Alguna pregunta? Jonathan, move. Tenemos tiempo, y luego 20 minutes. Sí, over there.
Can you hear me?
Not
Is
really.
it on or not?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry. I was just curious, because you're talking about working at higher education levels. We have students doing their practice teaching or student teaching in France, and they've been able to observe that in primary education, for example, there is no second language. And that more recently even, that when they do go into the second language, maybe at age 8 or something like that, that they can choose between English and Chinese?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, is this sort of projecting also that they'll be able to go up and be able to do this higher education in English or another language in the future? Because I think the problem is not just English, it's opening your mind to another language at an early age.
Yeah. In fact, in primary schools, what's happened is now all primary school children should have access, experience of another language. But the other language, it doesn't matter. It could be Chinese, German, Spanish, and it often is other languages, depending on which area of France you're in or the policy of the school. I mean, the idea, I think that's good, because it's the idea that little kids, they need to know what other languages are. They don't necessarily need to learn English from a very, very early age. And then we have some international classes in high schools. One of the problems with this program in primary schools is that it's, again, very teacher dependent. So it depends on the generation of teachers being able to, there aren't special language teachers for primary schools. So it's primary school teachers doing English teaching, or depending on the language they've learned. So that is a break on that, but I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, it was sort of, the thing is building it from a younger age.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the observation of our students was also that they were so surprised at the high cultural level these children had in French, and how they so much supported creative use of the language and writing poems and stories and things like that. And so even though they didn't know another language, they were admiring these other aspects. So I didn't say as a point of criticism, I was just saying that, you know, in order to get to this higher level where you can do higher education in another language, it's important from a young age to realize that language is a different way of thinking and doing things, and if not, it won't work, no?
Yeah, definitely, and that is definitely in the policy, and we hope that that will bring forward a generation of people who are very aware of multilingualism and the benefits of multilingualism.
Thank you, it was very interesting.
Thank you.
Anybody else? If not, you can approach, over there. Last question, and then you can ask Joanne as we have coffee.
Hanging around at coffee.
Over there, okay?
Happy to talk to you about this.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I come from the Autonomous University of Madrid, and we are involved also in developing different, an internationalization program, and we have a very successful training program for EMI. But my experience, both as developer or co-developer of the program and as attendant as student, we could say, and participant of the program, is that these kind of programs are too much focused on the teachers and too little in the students. And talking about how to change the culture and how to make this a community program, I have the feeling that this aspect of how the student's mind should be changed should be a bit more developed. But I don't know what your experience is. If you have any experience, I would really like to hear about it.
I totally agree with you, actually, on that. This program was very much, as I said, I'm an English teacher. I'm from that active, student-centered, and the student should be at the heart of the process. And in my head, when I started doing it, it's that the students are at the heart of the process behind the support and getting quality teaching out there, because there were a lot of negative strategies in English medium instruction, which were I'm just going to do what I can, and I'll just give them which were quite negative for students. So I think the program is helping. The focus on classroom is definitely instrumental in supporting students in these situations. But we do need to pay attention to this. And as I said, the first aim, was to kind of get things going and help the teachers, and interculturality was always there, but we weren't really dealing with it. That's one of the reasons why I'm very happy to be in this EQUIP project with Emma, because it's about making the learning group and helping the students see the value of being with other cultures. I think it's really important, but I think it's also, as I said, we're at this certain stage of development, and it was each thing in its time. I think also there's a generation gap. I find that the students are incredibly open and positive to this. And it's the generation of teachers, 40 plus, like myself, who have to, build the bridge. Students come with very strong expectations of being in international groups. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Joanne. Thank you for the interesting